Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 20 of Humanity versus Insanity. It seems quite a few weeks since I was last putting out an episode of Humanity versus Insanity, the Crane Report. That's primarily due to UK column taking a couple of weeks break. But also I spent the time, of course, on the front line of the anti-fracking campaign up at Crawberry Hill. And coming down to Plymouth today, unfortunately, I missed what turned out to be really quite an eventful day, a day of anti-fracking action all around the country. But more of that later on Fracking Nightmare, where we'll be presenting episode 34 live at 9 o'clock this evening. So Humanity versus Insanity. Well, sadly, the insanity continues. And to some extent, here we are in August of 2014, and it has a sense of deja vu about it, in that there is a mad rush to war yet again. And needless to say, I'm sure very few of our viewers out there need reminding that the British media right now is priming the British public for another military conflagration in the Middle East. This is the headline on the front page of the Daily Mail today. Britain dragged deeper into Iraq conflict. And we'll look at what happened in 2013 because sadly, although August the 26th, 2013 was an absolutely seminal date in British politics, because the establishment would rather forget what occurred on that day, it's been quietly buried, and very, very few people really have any idea what I'm talking about when I mention August 26th of last year. But what I want to do through this evening's show is just to look at a little bit of history of the manipulation, because these wars don't just happen. They are manipulated into being. They are perpetrated for a reason, and of course that reason is not one that benefits humanity. It benefits those who believe themselves to be the rightful rulers, wrongly of course, of a planetary fiefdom. So let's just go back a few years, and this photograph here is from 1975. And I'm sure it won't take too much to recognize the gentleman on the right there. That's Donald Rumsfeld. But the guy on the left might take a little bit more thinking about, because he's got hair. You have to imagine him without hair, and obviously some 40 years older. That is actually Dick Cheney. This is the Cheney-Rumsfeld partnership that has run right through the past 40 years of US politics. Now, the following year, Rumsfeld, there he is, appearing alongside Gerald Ford. So he was Chief of Staff for Gerald Ford. And in his role as Chief of Staff, he was responsible for managing the campaign to get Gerald Ford elected into the White House. Because, of course, Gerald Ford took over the role of presidency after Tricky Dicky, Richard Nixon, was forced to resign following the Watergate scandal. Well, Gerald Ford was running quite a long way back in the primaries. So Rumsfeld needed to come up with a scheme to get Gerald Ford back in the forefront of the American psyche. And in '76, in the months running up to the election, Rumsfeld became aware of an outbreak of swine flu at Fort Detrick. Now, there was only one US soldier affected at the time, but Rumsfeld decided to turn this into a massive epidemic, and immediately launched a press campaign to prepare the American public for this pandemic that was going to strike them all down, and started a campaign to vaccinate the American public. Well, after some 40 million people had been vaccinated, and it became apparent that more people were dying as a result of the vaccinations, and people were also developing a condition which became known as Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is effectively a paralysis. Then it was quietly decided that maybe this vaccination program should be quietly pushed back under the carpet. So this, didn't actually do Gerald Ford any favours, because of course he didn't get elected. But I think it was Jimmy Carter, wasn't it, who got elected at that point? Well, Rumsfeld didn't disappear from the scene, and here he is a few years later with the actor Ronald Reagan, who was certainly manipulated throughout his presidency. Of course, they tried to assassinate him, but the bodyguards who bundled him into the car when he tried to shoot Reagan, unfortunately, he missed the heart. So Reagan survived. Of course, all the suggestion that Reagan was shot by somebody from outside the vehicle has effectively been proven to be just as impossible as Lee Harvey Oswald shooting Kennedy from the book repository. So Rumsfeld was a primary financier and supporter of Reagan. At the time, he was the chief executive officer of a pharmaceutical company known as Searle. And Rumsfeld was trying to get a product known as aspartame into the food chain. But the head of the Food and Drug Administration rightly identified it as a toxin and stated that it had absolutely no place in the food chain whatsoever. Well, Rumsfeld decided that he could change this, so he agreed to finance and support Reagan's presidential campaign on the proviso that as soon as he was appointed as president, he would replace the existing head of the Food and Drug Administration, which he duly did, putting this pharmacist into the role, Arthur Hayes Hull Jr. So Arthur Hayes Hull Jr. is the guy who was manipulated into effectively causing many of the trauma that people experience today as a direct result of this toxin in their food. Of course, it is prevalent in sodas. And what is so outrageous is that if you go into a kids' play area in the UK, the likelihood is that every drink that's on sale there will be low sugar or sugar-free and loaded with aspartame, a toxin that has been linked directly to ADHD in children, which of course gets them on the pharmaceutical trail, because then they're prescribed the Ritalin and so on and so forth. And from that point, of course, the pharmaceutical industry effectively owns them. Well, after Rumsfeld had sold Searle, or managed the sale of Searle to Monsanto, and walked away with a nice little profit of about $10 million, he reappeared a few years later as the Secretary of State for Defense. And here he is greeting his buddy Saddam Hussein. And of course, it was Rumsfeld who effectively masterminded the Iran-Iraq war. Now, when you're going to put two countries to war, if you're going to get a really good fight, you've actually got to make sure that both sides have all the right toys. And of course, over the previous few years, the US had been openly selling armaments to Saddam. The problem was that the Iraqis rather had the advantage in terms of the military hardware. So to make it a more balanced fight, the Americans needed to get hardware to the Iranians, of course, which they did through the help of Oliver North and the Iran-Contra affair, thereby using the drug money that was accrued by the CIA as they ran the drugs business in the US, and then they were funneling that money into Iran and ensuring that Iran was appropriately kitted out. So a 6-year war that basically got both countries nowhere other than bombing the hell out of each other over a very narrow area around the Shatt al-Arab waterway. Well, once both countries realized that they were being manipulated, rather than openly acknowledge that, of course, they simply decided to effectively revert back to the pre-war borders. So Iran still retained the primary access to the Shatt al-Arab waterway, and Iraq had to accept that it had limited access. Well, at the same time, of course, or around about that time, the US also really wanted to try to get even greater control of Iraqi oil. The problem was that the cost of the Iran-Iraq war on the Iraq economy was really quite significant. And at the time, the price of a barrel of oil was a bit too low for Saddam Hussein's liking. He really needed a little more revenue to be able to rebuild the hospitals, the healthcare system that he'd established, and also to pay for the veterans' pensions and support the families of those that were, of course, killed or injured during the course of the Iran-Iraq war. So it would seem that getting a bit of an increase in the price of a barrel of oil was the easiest way to get those revenues. But OPEC weren't playing ball. And to add insult to injury, of course, the Kuwaitis were not only refusing to support the Iraq call for an increase in the price of an OPEC barrel, but they were also tapping into the oil under the neutral zone. This is a small area that is agreed between, or was agreed between Iraq and Kuwait, to be effectively no man's land, and neither country would drill in or under that area. Well, the Kuwaitis were using a process known as directional drilling to tap into it, and of course it didn't take Saddam too long to realize that this was going on. So needless to say, he wasn't best pleased, and he let it be known that he needed to take some action. And he was looking for some support from his former buddies, the US of A. And on the 25th of July in 1990, he met with the US ambassador, April Glaspie. He explained his problem, explained that he needed to get an increase in the price of a barrel of oil. He also explained that he had some deep concerns about the Kuwaitis tapping into the oil in the neutral zone. And April Glaspie basically said to Saddam that the US government, in fact, she said that she brought a message from Secretary of State James A. Baker III, that the US would not get involved in Arab conflict. Well, unfortunately, Saddam fell for the bait, hook, line, and sinker. And in the first few days of August, he launched his invasion of Kuwait, which gave the US the opportunity to establish Desert Shield, the forerunner to Desert Storm, whilst they pulled together the coalition of the willing with the objective of removing Saddam from Kuwait. In fact, the real objective, as we know from General Schwarzkopf, the real objective was not only to evict Saddam from Kuwait, but also to invade Iraq. But once the Iraqis were evicted from Kuwait, the Saudis knew immediately that the Americans wanted to continue and invade Iraq, and they let it be known that that was not going to happen, and it would not have the support of the Arab nations, and neither would it have the support of the rest of the world. So the Americans had to back off. But Schwarzkopf was caught saying by a journalist who had left his microphone on after a press conference had finished, and Schwarzkopf said, well, we might not be going to Baghdad, but at least we've poisoned their water for the next few millennia. A reference, of course, to the horrendous amounts of depleted uranium munitions that had been fired at and dropped on Iraqi territory in that period. Of course, the effects of that are still being felt today, and indeed have been exacerbated. Well, of course, we know that Saddam was sanctioned by the rest of the world. This was achieved through the Kuwaiti oil fires. And as I know many of you have heard me talk about before, the official version of events is a total construct. The fires were not set alight by the retreating Iraqi troops. The fires were set off by US Special Forces. And Tariq Aziz, who was a very highly respected statesman, not least because he was unique in Saddam's government in that he was Christian. And Tariq Aziz made the observation, he said, what benefit would we have from setting the wells alight? Which, of course, is absolutely the case. And the US, of course, got exactly what it wanted, which was the demonization of Saddam and Iraq and the imposition of sanctions, thus keeping Iraqi oil off the market and driving Iraq into economic poverty. And of course, another reason for that was, of course, that Iraq was outside of the central banking system. So this is the group of countries that are known as the axis of evil, and of course the common denominator is that they are outside the Rothschilds controlled banking system. Of course, the axis of evil is getting smaller and smaller all the time. Well, of course, in reality it's getting larger and larger, because the real evil is not the countries that are demonized. The real evil, of course, is the global corporatists that will stop at nothing before they achieve their ultimate power. So we roll the clock forward from 1991 to the early part of this century. And of course, after 9/11 and the subsequent awareness of the document known as Rebuilding America's Defenses, the document that was published in September of 2000 by the US neocons, stating their agenda for establishing global hegemony. Rumsfeld, of course, along with others, had signed a letter to Clinton in 1998 urging Clinton to invade Iraq. Fortunately, Clinton decided that he'd got enough troubles on his plate, so he decided not to do that. But in 2003, with the George W. Bush administration, supported by his buddy Tony Blair, they decided that they were going to invade Iraq. Now, there was a primary reason for this beyond the fact that there was unfinished business from 1991, and that was that on the day that the Supreme Court awarded George W. Bush the presidency, then Saddam announced that he would, from this day forward, be selling Iraqi oil in euros rather than US dollars. So although he was limited on the amount of oil that he could sell, he would sell it in euros rather than the petrodollar. Now, this had a phenomenal impact on the US dollar. The dollar dropped by 20%. From November of 2000 or early December of 2000 until the invasion in 2003. But let's have a look at some of the events in the UK at that time, because of course the socio-psychopath known as Charles Linton, here he is on the screen here, sorry, it's yes, Tony Charles Linton Blair. But if you want to find out a little bit more about it, then research Charles Linton. You might find something rather interesting. Well, here he is, of course, and he was determined to support George W. Bush in his attack on Iraq, regardless of the fact that there was no UN resolution to attack Saddam. And there was an absolutely remarkable piece of political history made in the days running up to that attack. And this is a very important part of British parliamentary and political history, as important, perhaps even more important, than August the 29th of last year. And that is the resignation speech of Robin Cook, Tony Blair's Foreign Secretary, who refused to support Blair's call for an attack on Iraq on the basis that the evidence that Tony Blair was putting forward to justify that attack on Iraq was not in the opinion of Robin Cook in any way substantiated. And I think at this particular juncture, it's well worth us reviewing and reflecting upon the words that Robin Cook had to share with Parliament in early 2003.
Order. Personal statement, Robin Cook.
Mr. Speaker, this is the first time for 20 years I have addressed the House from the back benches. I must confess I had forgotten how much better the view is from up here. None of those 20 years were more enjoyable or more rewarding than the past two, in which I have had the immense privilege of serving this House as the leader of the House. Made all the more enjoyable, Mr. Speaker, by the opportunity of working closely with yourself. It was frequently the necessity for me as leader of the House to talk my way out of accusations that a statement had been preceded by a press interview. On this occasion, I can say with complete confidence that no press interview has been given before this statement. I have chosen to address the House first on why I cannot support a war without international agreement or domestic support. The present Prime Minister is the most successful leader of the Labour Party in my lifetime. I hope he will continue to be the leader of our party, and I hope he will continue to be successful. I have no sympathy with, and I will give no comfort to those who want to use this crisis to displace him. I applaud the heroic efforts the Prime Minister has made in trying to secure a second resolution. I do not think anybody could have done better than the Foreign Secretary in working to get support for a second resolution within the Security Council. But the very intensity of those attempts underlines how important it was to succeed. Now that those attempts have failed, we cannot now pretend that getting a second resolution was of no importance. France has been at the receiving end of bucket loads of commentary in recent days. It is not France alone that wants more time for inspections. Germany wants more time for inspections. Russia wants more time for inspections. Indeed, at no time have we signed up even the minimum necessary to carry a second resolution. We delude ourselves if we think that the degree of international hostility is all the result of President Chirac. The reality is that Britain is being asked to embark on a war without agreement in any of the international bodies of which we are a leading partner. Not NATO, not the European Union, and now not the Security Council. To end up in such diplomatic weakness is a serious reverse. Only a year ago, we in the United States were part of a coalition against terrorism which was wider and more diverse than I would ever imagine would be possible. History will be astonished at the diplomatic miscalculations that led so quickly to the disintegration of that powerful coalition. The US can afford to go it alone, but Britain is not a superpower. Our interests are best protected not by unilateral action, but by multilateral agreement and a world order governed by rules. Yet tonight, the international partnerships most important to us are weakened. The European Union is divided. The Security Council is in stalemate. Those are heavy casualties of a war in which a shot has yet to be fired. I've heard some parallels between military action in these circumstances and the military action that we took in Kosovo. There was no doubt about the multilateral support we had for the action we took in Kosovo. It was supported by NATO. It was supported by the European Union. It was supported by every single one of the 7 neighbors in the region. France and Germany were our active allies. It is precisely because we have none of that support in this case that it was all the more important to get agreement in the Security Council as the last hope of demonstrating international agreement. And the legal basis for our action in Kosovo was the need to respond to an urgent and compelling humanitarian crisis. Our difficulty in getting support this time is that neither the international community nor the British public is persuaded that there is an urgent and compelling reason for this military action in Iraq. The threshold for war should always be high. None of us can predict the death toll of civilians from the forthcoming bombardment of Iraq. But the US warning of a bombing campaign that will shock and awe makes it likely that casualties will be numbered at least in the thousands. I am confident that British servicemen and British servicewomen will acquit themselves with professionalism and with courage. I hope that they all come back. I hope that Saddam even now will quit Baghdad and avert war. But you know, it is false to argue that only those who support war support our troops. It is entirely legitimate to support our troops while seeking an alternative to the conflict that will put those troops at risk. Nor is it fair to accuse those of us who want longer for inspections for not having an alternative strategy. For 4 years as Foreign Secretary, I was partly responsible for the Western strategy of containment. Over the past decade, that strategy destroyed more weapons than in the Gulf War, dismantled Iraq's nuclear weapons program, halted Saddam's medium and long-range missiles programs. Iraq's military strength is now less than half its size at the time of the last Gulf War. Ironically, it is only because Iraq's military forces are so weak that we can even contemplate its invasion. Some advocates of conflict claim his forces are now so weak, so demoralized, so badly equipped that the war will be over in a few days. Mr. Speaker, we cannot base our military strategy on the assumption that Saddam is weak and at the same time justify preemptive action on the claim that he is a threat. Iraq probably has no weapons of mass destruction in the commonly understood sense of the term, namely a credible device capable of being delivered against a strategic city target. It probably does still have biological toxins and battlefield chemical munitions, but it's had them since the 1980s, when US companies sold Saddam anthrax agents and the then British government approved chemical and munitions factories. Why is it now so urgent that we should take military action to disarm a military capacity that has been there for 20 years and which we helped to create? Why is it necessary to resort to war this week while Saddam's ambition to complete his weapons program is blocked by the presence of UN inspectors? Only a couple of weeks ago, Hans Blix told the Security Council that the key remaining disarmament tasks could be completed within months. I've heard it said that Iraq has not had months but 12 years in which to complete disarmament, and our patience is exhausted. Yet it is over 30 years since Resolution 242 called on Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories. We don't express the same impatience with the persistent refusal of Israel to comply. I welcome the strong personal commitment the Prime Minister has given to Middle East peace, but Britain's positive role in the Middle East does not redress the strong sense of injustice throughout the Muslim world at what they see as one rule for the allies of the US and another rule for the rest. Nor is our credibility helped by the appearance that our partners in Washington are less interested in disarmament than they are in regime change in Iraq. And that explains why any evidence that inspections may be showing progress is greeted in Washington not with satisfaction, but with consternation, because it reduces the case for war. What has come to trouble me most over past weeks is the suspicion that if the hanging chads in Florida had gone the other way and Al Gore had been elected, we would not now be about to commit British troops. Mr. Speaker, the longer I have served in this place, the greater the respect I have for the good sense and the collective wisdom of the British people. On Iraq, I believe the prevailing mood of the British people is sound. They do not doubt that Saddam is a brutal dictator, but they are not persuaded he is a clear and present danger to Britain. They want the inspections to be given a chance, and they suspect that they're being pushed too quickly into conflict by a US administration with an agenda of its own. Above all, they are uneasy at Britain going out on a limb in a military adventure without a broader international coalition and against the hostility of many of our traditional allies. From the start of the present crisis, as leader of this House, I've insisted on the right of this place to vote on whether Britain should go to war. It has been a favourite theme of commentators that this House no longer occupies a central role in British politics. Nothing could better demonstrate that they are wrong than for this House to stop the commitment of troops in a war which has neither international agreement nor domestic support. I intend to join those tomorrow night who vote against military action now. It is for that reason, and that reason alone, and with a heavy heart, that I've resigned from the government.
A remarkable speech. Now, some have argued that this was somewhat disingenuous of Robin Cook, seeing as he was Foreign Secretary when the UK participated in the attacks on both Kosovo and Sierra Leone, both of which were military actions which did not have UN sanction. There's also been much speculation that Robin Cook was part of the inner sanctum that really did know the detail behind the demise of Princess Di. But nonetheless, he had the courage to stand up for his conviction that Saddam had made a real effort under international pressure to reduce his arms. Needless to say, he was reluctant to get rid of all of his military hardware, and that was a fear that probably stood him in good stead for another 12 years, for the 12 years between 1991 and 2003. But in 2003, it's very clear that Bush and Blair and their global corporatist masters believed that Saddam was sufficiently weakened to launch a military action against him. The attack was one of absolute shock and awe. And this picture is one that is still pushed around the media to this day. This is George Bush landing on, I think it's the USS Lincoln in May of 2003 to announce mission accomplished. And a lot of people think that this was a statement that the military action in Iraq was over. It was not. The mission accomplished statement simply referred to the fact that from this day forward, Iraqi oil was once again being traded in US dollars. So this was a message to the money markets. Well, what was the cost? What has been the cost of that outrageous conflict? Well, of course, it's led to a horrendous cost in life. But these socio-psychopaths don't care about that at all. It is simply collateral damage. It's estimated that the number of US soldiers that have died, and this is a very conservative estimate, nearly 4,500, nearly 32,000 US soldiers wounded. And of course, the US troops coming back to the US, many of them are having a lot of difficulty. Part of this is due to the pharmaceuticals that were rammed down their throats during the times that they were in Iraq, supposedly to protect against the likelihood of chemical warfare. So it's estimated that some 22 former Iraqi vets are now committing suicide every single day. The 112,000 Iraqi civilians dead in the military action, but the total estimate is well over that. It's in the region of some 650,000. And the cost of the US economy estimated at 1.7 trillion. Well, that still leaves change out of the 2.3 trillion that apparently couldn't be accounted for in the Pentagon accounts. And of course, that was announced to the world, coincidentally, on September the 10th of 2001. And due to the events that unfolded the following day, that got quietly buried. Well, sadly, of course, the resignation of Robin Cook was perhaps significant, and his statements in Parliament, perhaps he knew too much on many other subjects, because we still don't know the real truth behind his death just 2.5 years later, whilst he was hill walking on August the 6th, 2005. Now, this tactic of getting leaders who are members of the countries of the axis of evil to reduce their military hardware, of course, continued. And here we have none other than Charles Linton with Gaddafi. And of course, his mission with Gaddafi was to get Gaddafi, to persuade Gaddafi that there was a place for him in the international community. But in the first instance, he had to reduce his military hardware. Here we have Berlusconi with Gaddafi. And guess what? This is Blair with President Assad and their respective wives back in 2009. And I mean, once again, of course, his role was to persuade Assad to reduce his military hardware so that the global corporatists would get the opportunity to arrange for a regime change and to destroy the nation. Now, one effect of this in both Iraq and in Libya, and now again potentially in Syria, is that these despotic leaders had control in their countries, and the multi-faith populations were able to coexist. A situation which is now not the case, as of course the Christian population in particular is being targeted in Iraq and would certainly be in Syria if Assad was removed from office. Now, I said about August the 26th of last year. On August the 26th of 2013, David Cameron recalled Parliament in an attempt to get Parliament to support his call for military action. The allegation was that Assad had launched a series of chemical weapons on the civilian population. All the evidence would suggest, even to this day, that that was not the case. It's very clear that the rebels did have access to chemical weapons, but it's most likely that those chemical weapons were actually provided by Saudi Arabia. And it's most likely that there was an unfortunate accident in that those chemical weapons were unfortunately released by people who were not trained in the appropriate handling. But it was a false flag to be blamed on Assad to create the opportunity to attack him. So with Cameron making the call to recall Parliament, to get the support of Parliament to attack the country, he needed the majority, and Obama needed Cameron to get that majority so that Obama could use that to simply get the Senate to rubber stamp the attack on the civilian population of Syria. Fortunately, the people of this country did something that in many cases they've never done before. They contacted their MPs. They contacted their MPs' offices. They made sure that the MP representing them, whether they voted for them or not, knew that they did not support another illegal war. The vote was very close, but many Tory politicians had the courage to vote against the party whip. The vote was 285 against attacking Syria and 272 in favour, a majority of just 13. If just 7 MPs had voted differently, we would most likely have been in World War III for best part of a year by now. Yet not happy with that, the socio-psychopathic global corporatists want to start another conflict. Whilst there is distraction, of course, the Israelis are seeking to pursue their genocidal attacks on the Palestinian communities. One of the primary objectives, of course, is to completely retake Gaza so that they can claim sovereignty over the offshore gas reserves in the Mediterranean. Meanwhile, of course, in the Ukraine, every effort is being made to demonize Russia as the bad boy in this conflict. But this is part of the globalist agenda to force the EU closer to the US. The US is desperate to find new markets for many of its products and certainly its new gas surplus. So by encouraging the EU to establish sanctions against Russia and cut off the gas imports from Russia, it creates a potential market for the surplus of US shale gas. Nothing is as it seems. Once again, it is going to be up to the British people to make contact with their MPs, get in contact with the MPs' offices, phone them up, go visit the surgery, let them know that once again, exactly as in 2013, the British people do not support yet another unauthorised, illegal global or conflict that will potentially turn global. We live in very interesting times. There are so many distractions right now. So much so that the vast majority of people simply just bury their heads in the sand or just turn the TV up a little bit louder or just make sure that they're up to date with the soaps or the local or the sports fixtures. Meanwhile, those whom you have elected, it's time to hold their feet to the fire. It's time to make them understand that they have fiduciary responsibility. That is the responsibility to those who elected them, not to the corporations, not to the arms industry, not to the oil and gas industry, not to the global financiers, but to those who elected them. There's an election coming up in May of next year. It's time to let those politicians know that if they don't represent the views of those who elected them, then they will not get back into Parliament. They will not be able to continue to ride that gravy train. I hear people say, we are the 99%. No, we're not. We're not the 99% because the bottom line is that 93% don't give a damn. 93% are locked right now into watching Coronation Street. We're certainly up against the 1%, but we're still 5 or 6%. Let's make it 7 or 8. When it's only 1 or 2%, we're just an irritant. When it's 5, 6, 7, 8%, we're a force to be reckoned with. This is Ian R. Crane. It's the 18th of August, 2014. Just 8 days shy of exactly a year since David Cameron lost the vote in Parliament last year. Let's make sure that if he recalls Parliament to get sanction to launch another war, he loses that vote yet again. That's it from me tonight. Join me at 9 o'clock for Fracking Nightmare.